Chapter 8. The Lock. Arthur Clennam stood in the street, waiting to ask some passer-by what place that was. He suffered a few people to pass him, in whose face there was no encouragement to make the inquiry, and still stood pausing in the street, when an old man came up and turned into the courtyard. He stooped a good deal, and plodded along in a slow, preoccupied manner, which made the bustling London thoroughfares no very safe resort for him. He was dirtily and meanly dressed, in a threadbare coat once blue, reaching to his ankles and buttoned to his chin, where it vanished in the pale ghost of a velvet collar. A piece of red cloth with which that phantom had been stiffened in its lifetime was now laid bare, and poked itself up at the back of the old man's neck, into a confusion of grey hair and rusty stock and buckle, which altogether nearly poked his hat off. A greasy hat it was, and a napless impending over his eyes, cracked and crumpled at the brim, and with a wisp of pocket-handkerchief dangling out below it. His trousers were so long and loose, and his shoes so clumsy and large, that he shuffled like an elephant, though how much of this was gait and how much trailing cloth and leather no one could have told. Under one arm he carried a limp and worn-out case, containing some wind instrument. In the same hand he had a pennyworth of snuff and a little packet of Whitney brown paper, from which he slowly comforted his poor blue old nose with a lengthened-out pinch as Arthur Clennam looked at him. To this old man crossing the courtyard he preferred his inquiry, touching him on the shoulder. The old man stopped and looked round, with the expression in his weak grey eyes of one whose thoughts had been far off, and who was a little dull of hearing also. "Pray, sir," said Arthur, repeating his question, "what is this place?" "Aye, this place," returned the old man, staying his pinch of snuff on its road, and pointing at the place without looking at it. "This is the Marshalsea, sir." "The debtor's prison?" "Sir," said the old man, with the air of deeming it not quite necessary to insist upon that designation, "the debtor's prison." He turned himself about and went on. "I beg pardon," said Arthur, stopping him once more, "but will you allow me to ask you another question? Can anyone go in?" "Anyone can go in," replied the old man, plainly adding by the significance of his emphasis, "but it is not everyone who can go out." "Pardon me once more. Are you familiar with the place?" "Sir," returned the old man, squeezing his little packet of snuff in his hand and turning upon his interrogator as if such questions hurt him, "I am." "I beg you to excuse me. I am not impertinently curious, but have a good object. Do you know the name of Dorrit here?" "My name, sir," replied the old man most unexpectedly, "is Dorrit." Arthur pulled off his hat to him. "Grant me the favour of half a dozen words. I was wholly unprepared for your announcement, and hope that assurance is my sufficient apology for having taken the liberty of addressing you. I have recently come home to England after a long absence. I have seen at my mother's, Mrs. Clennam, in the city, a young woman working at her needle, whom I have only heard addressed or spoken of as Little Dorrit. I have felt sincerely interested in her, and have had a great desire to know something more about her. I saw her, not a minute before you came up, pass in at that door." The old man looked at him attentively. "Are you a sailor, sir?" he asked. He seemed a little disappointed by the shake of the head that replied to him, "Not a sailor. I judged from your sunburnt face that you might be. Are you in earnest, sir?" "I do assure you that I am, and do entreat you to believe that I am in plain earnest." "I know very little of the world, sir," returned the other, who had a weak and quavering voice. "I am merely passing on like the shadow over the sundial. It would be worth no man's while to mislead me. It would really be too easy, too poor a success to yield any satisfaction. The young woman whom you saw go in here is my brother's child. My brother is William Dorrit. I am Frederick. You say you have seen her at your mother's. I know your mother befriends her. You have felt an interest in her, and you wish to know what she does here. Come and see." He went on again, and Arthur accompanied him. "My brother," said the old man, pausing on the step and slowly facing round again, "has been in here many years, and much that happens even among ourselves out of doors is kept from him for reasons that I needn't enter upon now. Be so good as to say nothing of my niece's working at her needle. Be so good as to say nothing that goes beyond what is said among us. If you keep within our bounds, you cannot well be wrong. Now, come and see." Arthur followed him down a narrow entry, at the end of which a key was turned and a strong door was opened from within. It admitted them into a lodge or lobby, across which they passed, and so through another door and a grating into the prison. The old man, always plodding on before, turned round in his slow, stiff, stooping manner when they came to the turnkey on duty, as if to present his companion. The turnkey nodded, and the companion passed in without being asked whom he wanted. The night was dark, and the prison lamps in the yard, and the candles in the prison windows faintly shining behind many sorts of wry old curtain and blind, had not the air of making it lighter. A few people loitered about, but the greater part of the population was within doors. The old man, taking the right-hand side of the yard, turned in at the third or fourth doorway, and began to ascend the stairs. "They are rather dark, sir, but you will not find anything in the way." He paused for a moment before opening a door on the second story. He had no sooner turned the handle than the visitor saw little Dorrit, and saw the reason of her setting so much store by dining alone. She had brought the meat home that she should have eaten herself, and was already warming it on a gird-iron over the fire for her father, clad in an old grey gown and a black cap, awaiting his supper at the table. A clean cloth was spread before him with knife, fork, and spoon, salt-cellar, pepper-box, glass, and pewter ale-pot. Such zests as his particular little phial of cayenne pepper and his pennyworth of pickles in a saucer were not wanting. She started, coloured deeply, and turned white. The visitor, more with his eyes than by the slight impulsive motion of his hand, entreated her to be reassured and to trust him. "I found this gentleman," said the uncle, "Mr. Clennam, William, son of Amy's friend, at the outer gate, wishful, as he was going by, of paying his respects, but hesitating whether to come in or not. This is my brother William, sir." "I hope," said Arthur, very doubtful what to say, "that my respect for your daughter may explain and justify my desire to be presented to you, sir." "Mr. Clennam," returned the other, rising, taking his cap off in the flat of his hand, and so holding it ready to put it on again, "you do me honour. You are welcome, sir," with a low bow. "Frederick, a chair. Pray sit down, Mr. Clennam." He put his black cap on again, as he had taken it off, and resumed his own seat. There was a wonderful air of benignity and patronage in his manner. These were the ceremonies with which he received the collegians. "You are welcome to the Marshalsea, sir. I have welcomed many gentlemen to these walls. Perhaps you are aware, my daughter Amy may have mentioned that I am the father of this place." So I have understood," said Arthur, dashing at the assertion. "You know, I dare say, that my daughter Amy was born here. A good girl, sir, a dear girl, and long a comfort and support to me. Amy, my dear, put this dish on. Mr. Clement will excuse the primitive customs to which we are reduced here. Is it a compliment to ask you if you would do me the honour, sir, to—" "Thank you," returned Arthur, "not a morsel." He felt himself quite lost in wonder at the manner of the man, and at the probability of his daughter's having had a reserve as to her family history should be so far out of his mind. She filled his glass, put all the little matters on the table ready to his hand, and then sat beside him while he ate his supper. Evidently in observance of their nightly custom, she put some bread before herself and touched his glass with her lips, but Arthur saw she was troubled and took nothing. Her look at her father, half admiring him and proud of him, half ashamed for him, all devoted and loving, went to his inmost heart. The father of the Marshalsea condescended towards his brother as an amiable, well-meaning man, a private character who had not arrived at distinction. "Frederick," said he, "you and Fanny sup at your lodgings tonight, I know. What have you done with Fanny, Frederick?" "She is walking with Tip." "Tip, as you may know, is my son, Mr. Clennam. He has been a little wild and difficult to settle, but his introduction to the world was rather—" He shrugged his shoulders with a faint sigh and looked round the room. "A little adverse." "Your first visit here, sir?" "My first." "You could hardly have been here since your boyhood without my knowledge. It very seldom happens that anybody of any pretensions, comes here without being presented to me. As many as 40 or 50 in a day have been introduced to my brother," said Frederick, faintly lighting up with a ray of pride. "Yes," the father of the Marshalsea assented, "we have even exceeded that number. On a fine Sunday in term it is quite a levee. Amy, my dear, I have been trying half the day to remember the name of the gentleman from Camberwell who was introduced to me last Christmas week by that agreeable coal merchant who was remanded for 6 months. "I don't remember his name, father." "Frederick, do you remember his name?" Frederick doubted if he had ever heard it. No one could doubt that Frederick was the last person upon earth to put such a question to with any hope of information. "I mean," said his brother, "the gentleman who did that handsome action with so much delicacy. Tush, the name has quite escaped me. Mr. Clennam, as I have happened to mention handsome and delicate action, you may like, perhaps, to know what it was." "Very much," said Arthur, withdrawing his eyes from the delicate head beginning to droop and the pale face with a new solicitude stealing over it. "It is so generous and shows so much fine feeling that it is almost a duty to mention it. I said at the time that I always would mention it on every suitable occasion without regard to personal sensitiveness. It's of no use to disguise the fact. You must know, Mr. Clennam, that it does sometimes occur that people who come here desire to offer some little, testimonial to the father of the place." To see her hand upon his arm in mute entreaty half repressed, and her timid little shrinking figure turning away, was to see a sad, sad sight. "Sometimes," he went on in a low, soft voice, agitated and clearing his throat every now and then, "sometimes it takes one shape and sometimes another, but it is generally money, and it is, I cannot but confess it is too often acceptable. This gentleman that I refer to was presented to me, Mr. Clennam, in a manner highly gratifying to my feelings, and conversed not only with great politeness, but with great, information." All this time, though he had finished his supper, he was nervously going about his plate with his knife and fork, as if some of it was still before him. "It appeared from his conversation that he had a garden, though he was a delicate of mentioning it at first, as gardens are not accessible to me, but it came out, through my admiring a very fine cluster of geranium, beautiful cluster of geranium to be sure, which he had brought from his conservatory. On my taking note of its rich colour, he showed me a piece of paper round it on which was written, 'For the father of the Marshalsea,' and presented it to me. But this was, not all. He made a particular request on taking leave that I would remove the paper in half an hour. I did so, and I found that it contained 2 guineas. I assure you, Mr. Clennam, I have received testimonials in many ways and of many degrees of value, and they have always been unfortunately acceptable, but I never was more pleased with this particular testimonial." Arthur was in the act of saying the little he could say on such a theme when a bell rang to ring, and footsteps approached the door. A pretty girl of a far better figure and much more developed than little Dorrit, though looking much younger in the face, when the two were observed together, stopped in the doorway on seeing a stranger, and a young man who was with her stopped too. Mr. Clennam, Fanny, my eldest daughter and my son, Mr. Clennam. The bell is a signal for visitors to retire, and so they have come to say good night. But there is plenty of time, plenty of time. Girls, Mr. Clennam will excuse any household business you may have together. He knows, I dare say, that I have but one room here. I only want my clean dress from Amy, father, said the second girl. And I clothes, said Tip. Amy opened a drawer in an old piece of furniture that was a chest of drawers above and a bedstead below, and produced 2 little bundles, which she handed to her brother and sister. Mended and made up? Clennam heard the sister ask in a whisper, to which Amy answered, yes. He had risen now, and took the opportunity of glancing round the room. The bare walls had been coloured green, evidently by an unskilled hand, and were poorly decorated with a few prints. The window was curtained and the floor carpeted, and there were shelves and pegs and other such conveniences that had accumulated in the course of years. It was a close, confined room, poorly furnished, and the chimney smoked to boot, or the tin screen at the top of the fireplace was superfluous. But constant pains and care had made it neat, and even, after its kind, comfortable. All the while the bell was ringing, and the uncle was anxious to go. Come, Fanny, he said, with his ragged clarionet case under his arm. The lock, child, the lock. Fanny bade her father good night and whisked off airily. Tip had already clattered downstairs. Now, Mr. Clennam, said the uncle, looking back as he shuffled out after them. The lock, sir, the lock. Mr. Clennam had 2 things to do before he followed. 1, to offer his testimonial to the father of the Marshalsea without giving pain to his child, the other to say something to that child, though it were but a word, in explanation of his having come there. Allow me, said the father, to see you downstairs. She had slipped out after the rest, and they were alone. Not on any account, said the visitor hurriedly. Pray allow me to— Chink, chink, chink. Mr. Clennam, said the father, I am deeply, deeply— But his visitor had shut up his hand to stop the clinking, and had gone downstairs with great speed. He saw no little Dorrit on his way down or in the yard. The last 2 or 3 stragglers were hurrying to the lodge, and he was following, when he caught sight of her in the doorway of the first house from the entrance. He turned back hastily. Pray forgive me, he said, for speaking to you here. Pray forgive me for coming here at all. I followed you tonight. I did so that I might endeavour to render you and your family some service. You know the terms on which I and my mother are, and may not be surprised that I have preserved our distant relations at her house, lest I should unintentionally make her jealous or resentful, or do you any injury in her estimation. What I have seen here in this short time has greatly increased my heartfelt wish to be a friend to you. It would recompense me for such disappointment if I could hope to gain your confidence. She was scared at first, but seemed to take courage while he spoke to her. You are very good, sir. You speak very earnestly to me, but I wish you had not watched me. He understood the emotion with which she said it to arise in her father's behalf, and he respected it and was silent. Mrs. Clennam has been of great service to me. I don't know what we should have done without the employment she has given me. I am afraid it may not be a good return to become secret with her. I can say no more tonight, sir. I am sure you mean to be kind to us. Thank you. Thank you. Let me ask you one question before I leave. Have you known my mother long? I think 2 years, sir. The bell has stopped. How did you know her first? Did she send here for you? No. She does not even know that I live here. We have a friend, father and I, a poor labouring man, but the best of friends, and I wrote out that I wished to do needlework and gave his address. And he got what I wrote out displayed at a few places where it cost nothing, and Mrs. Clennam found me that way and sent for me. The gate will be locked, sir. She was so tremulous and agitated, and he was so moved by compassion for her, and by deep interest in her story as it dawned upon him, that he could scarcely tear himself away. But the stoppage of the bell and the quiet in the prison were a warning to depart, and with a few hurried words of kindness he left her gliding back to her father. But he remained too late. The inner gate was locked and the lodge closed. After a little fruitless knocking with his hand, he was standing there with the disagreeable conviction upon him that he had got to get through the night, when a voice accosted him from behind. "Caught, eh?" said the voice. "You won't go home till morning. Oh, it's you, is it, Mr. Clennam?" The voice was Tip's, and they stood looking at one another in the prison yard as it began to rain. "You've done it," observed Tip. "You must be sharper than that next time." "But you are locked in too," said Arthur. "I believe I am," said Tip sarcastically. "But not in your way. I belong to the shop, only my sister has a theory that our governor must never know it. I don't see why myself." "Can I get any shelter?" asked Arthur. "What had I better do?" "We had better get hold of Amy first of all," said Tip, referring any difficulty to her as a matter of course. "I would rather walk about all night. It's not much to do than give that trouble." "You needn't do that, if you don't mind paying for a bed. If you don't mind paying, they'll make you up one on the snuggery table, under the circumstances. If you'll come along, I'll introduce you there." As they passed down the yard, Arthur looked up at the window of the room he had lately left, where the light was still burning. "Yes, sir," said Tip, following his glance. "That's the governor's. She'll sit with him for another hour, reading yesterday's paper to him, or something of that sort, and then she'll come out like a little ghost and vanish away without a sound." "I don't understand you." "The governor sleeps up in the room, and she has a lodging at the turnkey's. First house there," said Tip, pointing out the doorway into which she had retired. "First house, sky parlour. She pays twice as much for it she would for one twice as good outside, but she stands by the governor, poor dear girl, day and night." This brought them to the tavern establishment at the upper end of the prison, where the collegians had just vacated their social evening club. The apartment on the ground floor in which it was held was the snuggery in question. The presidential tribune of the chairman, the pewter pots, glasses, pipes, tobacco ashes, and general flavour of members were still as that convivial institution had left them on its adjournment. The snuggery had two of the qualities popularly held to be essential to grog for ladies, in respect that it was hot and strong, but in the third point of analogy, requiring plenty of it, the snuggery was defective, being but a cooped-up apartment. The unaccustomed visitor from outside naturally assumed everybody here to be prisoners, landlord, waiter, barmaid, potboy, and all. Whether they were or not did not appear, but they all had a weedy look. The keeper of a chandler's shop in a front parlour, who took in gentlemen boarders, lent his assistance in making the bed. He had been a tailor in his time and kept a phaeton, he said. He boasted that he stood up litigiously for the interests of the college, and he had undefined and undefinable ideas that the marshal intercepted a fund which ought to come to the collegians. He liked to believe this, and always impressed the shadowy grievance on newcomers and strangers, though he could not, for his life, have explained what fund he meant, or how the notion had got rooted in his soul. He had fully convinced himself, notwithstanding, that his own proper share of the fund was 3 and 9pence a week, and that in this amount he, as individual collegian, was swindled by the marshal regularly every Monday. Apparently, he helped to make the bed, that he might not lose an opportunity of stating this case, after which unloading of his mind, and after announcing, as it seemed he always did, without anything coming of it, that he was going to write a letter to the papers and show the marshal up, he fell into miscellaneous conversation with the rest. It was evident from the general tone of the whole party that they had come to regard insolvency as the normal state of mankind, and the payment of debts as a disease that occasionally broke out. In this strange scene, and with these strange spectres flitting about him, Arthur Clennam looked on at the preparations as if they were part of a dream, pending which the long-initiated Tip, with an awful enjoyment of the snuggery's resources, pointed out the common kitchen fire, maintained by a subscription of collegians, the boiler for hot water supported in like manner, and other premises generally tending to the deduction that the way to be healthy, wealthy, and wise was to come to the Marshalsea. The two tables, put together in a corner, were, at length, converted into a very fair bed, and the stranger was left to the Windsor chairs, the presidential tribune, the beery atmosphere, sawdust, pipe lights, spittoons, and repose. But the last item was long, long, long in linking itself to the rest. The novelty of the place, the coming upon it without preparation, the sense of being locked up, the remembrance of that room upstairs, of the two brothers, and above all, of the retiring childish form, and the face in which he now saw years of insufficient food, if not of want, kept him waking and unhappy. Speculations, too, bearing the strangest relations towards the prison, but always concerning the prison, ran like nightmares through his mind while he lay awake. Whether coffins were kept ready for people who might die there, where they were kept, how they were kept, where people who died in the prison were buried, how they were taken out, what forms were observed, whether an implacable creditor could arrest the dead. As to escaping, what chances there were of escape, whether a prisoner could scale the walls with a cord and grapple, how he would descend upon the other side, whether he could alight on a housetop, steal down a staircase, let himself out at a door, and get lost in the crowd. As to fire in the prison, if one were to break out while he lay there. And these involuntary starts of fancy were, after all, but the setting of a picture in which three people kept before him. His father, the steadfast look with which he had died, prophetically darkened forth in the portrait. His mother, with her arm up, warding off his suspicion. Little Dorrit, with her hand on the degraded arm, and her drooping head turned away. What if his mother had an old reason she well knew for softening to this poor girl? What if the prisoner, now sleeping quietly, heaven grant it, by the light of the great day of judgment should trace back his fall to her? What if any act of hers and of his father's should have even remotely brought the grey heads of these two brothers so low? A swift thought shot into his mind. In that long imprisonment here, and in her own long confinement to her room, did his mother find a balance to be struck? I admit that I was necessary to that man's captivity. I have suffered for it in kind. He has decayed in his prison. I in mine. I have paid the penalty. When all the other thoughts had faded out, this one held possession of him. When he fell asleep, she came before him in her wheeled chair, warding him off with this justification. When he awoke and sprang up, causelessly frightened, the words were in his ears, as if her voice had slowly spoken them at his pillow, to break his rest. He withers away in his prison, I wither away in mine. Inexorable justice is done. What do I owe on this score? Chapter 9. Little Mother. The morning light was in no hurry to climb the prison wall and look in at the snuggery windows, and when it did come, it would have been more welcome if it had come alone, instead of bringing a rush of rain with it. But the equinoctial gales were blowing out at sea, and the impartial southwest wind, in its flight, would not neglect even the narrow Marshalsea. While it roared through the steeple of St. George's Church and twirled all the cows in the neighbourhood, it made a swoop to beat the Southwark smoke into the jail, and, plunging down the chimneys of the few only collegians who were yet lighting their fires, half suffocated them. Arthur Clennam would have been little disposed to linger in bed, though his bed had been in a more private situation, and less affected by the raking out of yesterday's fire, the kindling of today's under the collegiate boiler, the filling of that Spartan vessel at the pump, the sweeping and sawdusting of the common room, and other such preparations. Heartily glad to see the morning, though little rested by the night, He turned out as soon as he could distinguish objects about him, and paced the yard for 2 heavy hours before the gate was opened. The walls were so near to one another, and the wild clouds hurried over them so fast, that it gave him a sensation like the beginning of seasickness to look up at the gutsy sky. The rain, carried aslant by flaws of wind, blackened that side of the central building which he had visited last night, but left a narrow dry trough under the lee of the wall, where he walked up and down among the weights of straw and dust and paper, the waste droppings of the pump, and the stray leaves of yesterday's greens. It was as haggard a view of life as a man need look upon. Nor was it relieved by any glimpse of the little creature who had brought him there. Perhaps she glided out of her doorway and in at that where her father lived, while his face was turned from both. He saw nothing of her. It was too early for her brother. To have seen him once was to have seen enough of him to know that he would be sluggish to leave whatever frowsy bed he occupied at night. So, as Arthur Clennam walked up and down, waiting for the gate to open, he cast about in his mind for future rather than for present means of pursuing his discoveries. At last the lodge gate turned, and the turnkey, standing on the step, taking an early comb at his hair, was ready to let him out. With a joyful sense of release, he passed through the lodge and found himself again in the little outer courtyard where he had spoken to the brother last night. There was a string of people already straggling in, whom it was not difficult to identify as the nondescript messengers, go-betweens, and errand-bearers of the place. Some of them had been lounging in the rain until the gate should open. Others, who had timed their arrival with greater nicety, were coming up now, and passing in with damp, whitey-brown paper bags from the grocer's, loaves of bread, lumps of butter, eggs, milk, and the like. The shabbiness of these attendants upon shabbiness, the poverty of these insolvent waiters upon insolvency, was a sight to see. Such threadbare coats and trousers, such fusty gowns and shawls, such squashed hats and bonnets, such boots and shoes, such umbrellas and walking sticks, never were seen in rag fair. All of them wore the cast-off clothes of other men, and women were made up of patches and pieces of other people's individuality, and had no sartorial existence of their own proper. Their walk was the walk of a race apart. They had a peculiar way of doggedly slinking round the corner, as if they were eternally going to the pawnbroker's. When they coughed like people accustomed to be forgotten on doorsteps and in draughty passages, waiting for answers to letters in faded ink which gave the recipients of those manuscripts great mental disturbance and no satisfaction. As they eyed the stranger in passing, they eyed him with burrowing eyes, hungry, sharp, speculative, as to his softness if they were accredited to him, and the likelihood of his standing something handsome. Mendicity on commission stooped in their high shoulders, shambled in their unsteady legs, buttoned and pinned and darned and dragged their clothes, frayed their buttonholes, leaked out of their figures in dirty little ends of tape, and issued from their mouths in alcoholic breathings. As these people passed him standing still in the courtyard, and one of them turned back to inquire if he could assist him with his services, it came into Arthur Clennam's mind that he would speak to little Dorrit again before he went away. She would have recovered her first surprise, and might feel easier with him. He asked this member of the fraternity, who had 2 red herrings in his hand and a loaf and a blacking brush under his arm, where was the nearest place to get a cup of coffee at. The nondescript replied in encouraging terms, and brought him to a coffee shop in the street within a stone's throw. "Do you know Miss Dorrit?" asked the new client. The nondescript knew 2 Miss Dorrits, one who was born inside. That was the one. That was the one? The nondescript had known her many years. In regard of the other Miss Dorrit, the nondescript lodged in the same house with herself and uncle. This changed the client's half-formed design of remaining at the coffee shop until the nondescript should bring him word that Dorrit had issued forth into the street. He entrusted the nondescript with a confidential message to her, importing that the visitor who had waited on her father last night begged the favour of a few words with her at her uncle's lodging. He obtained from the same source full directions to the house, which was very near, dismissed the nondescript gratified with half-a-crown, and having hastily refreshed himself at the coffee-shop, repaired with all speed to the clarionet player's dwelling. There were so many lodgers in this house that the doorposts seemed to be as full of bell-handles as a cathedral organ is of stops. Doubtful which might be the clarionet stop, he was considering the point when a shuttlecock flew out of the parlour window and alighted on his hat. He then observed that in the parlour window was a blind with the inscription, Mr. Cripple's Academy, also in another line, Evening Tuition, and behind the blind was a little white-faced boy with a slice of bread and butter and a battledore. The window being accessible from the footway, he looked in over the blind, returned the shuttlecock, and put his question. "Dorrit," said the little white-faced boy, Master Cripples, in fact. "Mr. Dorrit, third bell and one knock." The pupils of Mr. Cripples appeared to have been making a copy-book of the street door. It was so extensively scribbled over in pencil. The frequency of the inscriptions Old Dorrit and Dirty Dick in combination suggested intentions of personality on the part of Mr. Cripple's pupils. There was ample time to make these observations before the door was opened by the poor old man himself. "Ah," said he, very slowly remembering Arthur, "you were shut in last night." "Yes, Mr. Dorrit. I hope to meet your niece here presently." "Oh," said he, pondering. "Out of my brother's way. True. Would you come upstairs and wait for her?" "Thank you." Turning himself as slowly as he turned in his mind whatever he heard or said, he led the way up the narrow stairs. The house was very close, and had an unwholesome smell. The little staircase windows looked in at the back windows of other houses as unwholesome as itself, with poles and lines thrust out of them, on which unsightly linen hung, as if the inhabitants were angling for clothes, and had had some wretched bites not worth attending to. In the back garret, a sickly room, with a turn-up bedstead in it, so hastily and recently turned up that the blankets were boiling over, as it were, and keeping the lid open, a half-finished breakfast of coffee and toast for 2 persons was jumbled down anyhow on a rickety table. There was no one there. The old man, mumbling to himself after some consideration that Fanny had run away, went to the next room to fetch her back. The visitor, observing that she held the door on the inside, and that when the uncle tried to open it there was a sharp adjuration of "Don't, stupid," and an appearance of loose stocking and flannel, concluded that the young lady was in an undress. The uncle, without appearing to come to any conclusion, shuffled in again, sat down in his chair, and began warming his hands at the fire, not that it was cold, or that he had any waking idea whether it was or not. "What do you think of my brother, sir?" he asked, when he, by and by, discovered what he was doing, left off, reached over to the chimney-piece, and took his clarionet case down. "I was glad," said Arthur, very much at a loss, for his thoughts were on the brother before him, "to find him so well and cheerful." "Ah," muttered the old man, "yes. Arthur wondered what he could possibly want with the clarionet case. He did not want it at all. He discovered, in due time, that it was not the little paper of snuff, which was also on the chimney-piece, put it back again, took down the snuff instead, and solaced himself with a pinch. He was as feeble, spare, and slow in his pinches as in everything else, but a certain trickling of enjoyment of them played in the poor worn nerves about the corners of his eyes and mouth. "Amy, Mr. Clennam, what do you think of her?" I am much impressed, Mr. Dorrit, by all that I have seen of her and thought of her. My brother would have been quite lost without Amy, he returned. We should all have been lost without Amy. She is a very good girl, Amy. She does her duty. Arthur fancied that he heard in these praises a certain tone of custom, which he had heard from the father last night with an inward protest and feeling of antagonism. It was not that they stinted her praises or were insensible to what she did for them, but they were lazily habituated to her, as they were to all the rest of their condition. He fancied that although they had before them every day the means of comparison between her and one another and themselves, they regarded her as being in her necessary place, as holding a position towards them all which belonged to her, like her name or her age. He fancied that they viewed her not as having risen away from the prison atmosphere, but as appertaining to it, as being vaguely what they had a right to expect and nothing more. Her uncle resumed his breakfast, and was munching toast, sopped in coffee, oblivious of his guest, when the third bell rang. That was Amy, he said, and went down to let her in, leaving the visitor with as vivid a picture on his mind of his begrimed hands, dirt-worn face, and decayed figure as if he were still drooping in his chair. She came up after him, in the usual plain dress and with the usual timid manner. Her lips were a little parted, as if her heart beat faster than usual. "Mr. Clement, Amy," said her uncle, "has been expecting you some time. I took the liberty of sending you a message." "I received a message, sir." "Are you going to my mother's this morning?" "I think not, for it is past your usual hour." "Not today, sir. I'm not wanted today." "Will you allow me to walk a little way in whatever direction you may be going? I can speak to you as we walk, both without detaining you here and without intruding longer here myself." She looked embarrassed, but said if he pleased. He made a pretence of having mislaid his walking-stick to give her time to set the bedstead right, to answer her sister's impatient knock at the wall, and to say a word softly to her uncle. Then he found it, and they went downstairs, she first, he following, the uncle standing at the stairhead, and probably forgetting them before they had reached the ground floor. Mr. Cripple's pupils, who were by this time coming to school, desisted from their morning recreation of cuffing one another with bags and books, to stare with all the eyes they had at a stranger who had been to see Dirty Dick. They bore the trying spectacle in silence until the mysterious visitor was at a safe distance, when they burst into pebbles and yells, and likewise into reviling dances, and in all respects buried the pipe of peace with so many savage ceremonies that, if Mr. Cripples had been the chief of the Cripple-Weeaboo tribe with his war paint on, they could scarcely have done greater justice to their education. In the midst of this homage, Mr. Arthur Clennam offered his arm to little Dorrit, and little Dorrit took it. "Will you go by the iron bridge," said he, "where there is an escape from the noise of the street?" Little Dorrit answered, if he pleased, and presently ventured to hope that he would not mind Mr. Cripple's boys, for she had herself received her education, such as it was, in Mr. Cripple's evening academy. He returned with the best will in the world that Mr. Cripple's boys were forgiven out of the bottom of his soul. Thus did Cripples unconsciously become a master of the ceremonies between them, and bring them more naturally together than Beau Nash might have done if they had lived in his golden days, and he had alighted from his coach and six for the purpose. The morning remained squally, and the streets were miserably muddy, but no rain fell as they walked towards the iron bridge. The little creature seemed so young in his eyes that there were moments when he found himself thinking of her, if not speaking to her, as if she were a child. Perhaps he seemed as old in her eyes as she seemed young in his. "I am sorry to hear you were so inconvenienced last night, sir, as to be locked in. It was very unfortunate." "It was nothing," he returned. He had had a very good bed. Oh, yes, she said quickly. She believed there were excellent beds at the coffee house. He noticed that the coffee house was quite a majestic hotel to her, and that she treasured its reputation. I believe it is very expensive, said little Dorrit, but my father has told me that quite beautiful dinners may be got there. And wine, she added timidly. Were you ever there? Oh, no, only into the kitchen to fetch hot water. To think of growing up with a kind of awe upon one as to the luxuries of that superb establishment, the Marshalsea Hotel. I asked you last night, said Clennam, how you had become acquainted with my mother. Did you ever hear her name before she sent for you? No, sir. Do you think your father ever did? No, sir. He met her eyes raised to his with so much wonder in them, she was scared when the encounter took place and shrunk away again, that he felt it necessary to say, I have reason for asking which I cannot very well explain, but you must on no account suppose it to be of a nature to cause you the least harm or anxiety. Quite the reverse. And you think that at no time of your father's life was my name of Clennam ever familiar to him? No, sir. He felt from the tone in which she spoke that she was glancing up at him with those parted lips. Therefore he looked before him rather than make her heart beat quicker still by embarrassing her afresh. Thus they emerged upon the iron bridge, which was as quiet after the roaring streets as though it had been open country. The wind blew roughly, the wet squalls came rattling past them, skimming the pools on the road and pavement, and raining them down into the river. The clouds raced on furiously in the lead-coloured sky. The smoke and mist raced after them. The dark tide ran fierce and strong in the same direction. Little Dorrit seemed the least, the quietest, and weakest of heaven's creatures. Let me put you in a coach, said Clennam, very nearly adding, my poor child. She hurriedly declined, saying that wet or dry made little difference to her. She was used to go about in all weathers. He knew it to be so, and was touched with more pity, thinking of the slight figure at his side making its nightly way through the damp, dark, boisterous streets to such a place of rest. You spoke so feelingly to me last night, sir, and I found afterwards that you had been so generous to my father, that I could not resist your message, if it was only to thank you, especially as I wished very much to say to you—" She hesitated and trembled, and tears rose in her eyes but did not fall. "To say to me?" "That I hope you will not misunderstand my father. Don't judge him, sir, as you would judge others outside the gates. He has been there so long I never saw him outside, but I can understand that he must have grown different in some things since. My thoughts will never be unjust or harsh towards him, believe me." "Not?" she said, and with a prouder air, as the misgiving evidently crept upon her that she might seem to be abandoning him. "Not that he has anything to be ashamed of for himself, or that I have anything to be ashamed of for him. He only requires to be understood. I only ask for him that his life may be fairly remembered. All that he said was quite true. It all happened just as he related it. He is very much respected. Everybody who comes in is glad to know him. He is more courted than anyone else. He is far more thought of than the Marshal is." If ever pride were innocent, it was innocent in little Dorrit when she grew boastful of her father. "It is often said that his manners are a true gentleman's, and quite a study. I see none like them in that place, but he is admitted to be superior to all the rest. This is quite as much why they make him presents, as because they know him to be needy. He is not to be blamed for being in need, poor love. Who could be in prison a quarter of a century and be prosperous?" What affection in her words, what compassion in her repressed tears, what a great soul of fidelity within her! How true the light that shed false brightness round him! "If I have found it best to conceal where my home is, it is not because I am ashamed of him, God forbid, nor am I so much ashamed of the place itself as might be supposed. People are not bad because they come here. I have known numbers of good, persevering, honest people come here through misfortune. They are almost all kind-hearted to one another, and it would be ungrateful indeed to me to forget that I have had many quiet, comfortable hours there, that I had an excellent friend there when I was quite a baby, who was very, very fond of me, that I have been taught there, and have worked there, and have slept soundly there. I think it would be almost cowardly and cruel not to have had some little attachment for it, after all this." She had relieved the faithful fullness of her heart, and modestly said, raising her eyes appealingly to her new friends, "I did not mean to say so much, nor have I ever but once spoken about this before, but it seems to set it more right than it was last night. I said I wished you had not followed me, sir. I do not wish it so much now, unless you should think— indeed, I don't wish it at all, unless I should have spoken so confusedly that you can scarcely understand me, which I am afraid may be the case." He told her with perfect truth that it was not the case, and putting himself between her and the sharp wind and rain, sheltered her as well as he could. "I feel permitted now," he said, "to ask you a little more concerning your father. Has he many creditors?" "Oh, a great number. I mean detaining creditors who keep him where he is." "Oh, yes, a great number. Can you tell me— I can get the information no doubt elsewhere, if you cannot— who is the most influential of them?" Little Dorrit said, after considering a little, that she used to hear long ago of a Mr. Tite Barnacle as a man of great power. He was a commissioner or a board or a trustee or something. He lived in Grosvenor Square, she thought, or very near it. He was under government, high in the Circumlocution Office. She appeared to have acquired in her infancy some awful impression of the might of this formidable Mr. Tite Barnacle of Grosvenor Square, or very near it, and the Circumlocution Office, which quite crushed her when she mentioned it. "It can do no harm," thought Arthur, "if I see this Mr. Tite Barnacle." The thought did not present itself so quietly, but her quickness intercepted it. "Ah," said Little Dorrit, shaking her head with the mild despair of a lifetime. "Many people used to think once of getting my poor father out, but you don't know how hopeless it is." She forgot to be shy at the moment in honestly warning him away from the sunken wreck he had a dream of raising, and looked at him with eyes which assuredly, in association with her patient face, her fragile figure, her spare dress, and the wind and rain, did not turn him from his purpose of helping her. "Even if it could be done," said she, "and it never can be done now, where could father live, or how could he live? I have often thought that if such a change could come, it might be anything but a service to him now. People might not think so well of him outside as they do there. He might not be so gently dealt with outside as he is there. He might not be so fit himself for the life outside as he is for that." Here, for the first time, she could not restrain her tears from falling, and the little thin hands he had watched when they were so busy trembled as they clasped each other. "It would be a new distress to him even to know that I earn a little money, and that Fanny earns a little money. He is so anxious about us, you see, feeling helplessly shut up there. Such a good, good father." He let the little burst of feeling go by before he spoke. It was soon gone. She was not accustomed to think of herself or to trouble anyone with her emotions. He had but glanced away at the piles of city roofs and chimneys among which the smoke was rolling heavily, and at the wilderness of masts on the river, and the wilderness of steeples on the shore, indistinctly mixed together in the stormy haze, when she was again as quiet as if she had been plying her needle in his mother's room. "You would be glad to have your brother set at liberty?" "Oh, very, very glad, sir." "Well, we will hope for him at least. You told me last night of a friend you had." "His name was Plornish," Little Dorrit said. "And where did Plornish live?" "Plornish lived in Bleeding Heart Yard. He was only a plasterer." Little Dorrit said, as a caution to him not to form high social expectations of Plornish. "He lived at the last house in Bleeding Heart Yard, and his name was over a little gateway." Arthur took down the address and gave her his. He had now done all he sought to do for the present, except that he wished to leave her with a reliance upon him and to have something like a promise from her that she would cherish it. "There is one friend," he said, putting up his notebook. "As I take you back—" "You are going back?" "Oh, yes, going straight home." "As I take you back," the word jarred upon him, "let me ask you to persuade yourself that you have another friend. I make no professions and say no more." "You are truly kind to me, sir. I am sure I need no more." They walked back through the miserable muddy streets and among the poor mean shops, and were jostled by the crowds of dirty hucksters usual to a poor neighbourhood. There was nothing by the short way that was pleasant to any of the five senses. Yet it was not a common passage through common rain and mire and noise to Clennam, having this little, slender, careful creature on his arm. How young she seemed to him, or how old he to her, or what a secret either to the other. In that beginning of the destined interweaving of their stories, matters not here. He thought of her having been bred among these scenes, and shrinking through them now, familiar yet misplaced. He thought of her long acquaintance with the squalid needs of life, and of her innocence, of her solicitude for others, and her few years, and her childish aspect. They were come into the High Street, where the prison stood, when a voice cried, "Little mother, little mother!" Little Dorrit, stopping and looking back, an excited figure of a strange kind bounced against them, still crying, "Little mother," fell down and scattered the contents of a large basket filled with potatoes in the mud. "Oh, Maggie," said Little Dorrit, "what a clumsy child you are." Maggie was not hurt, but picked herself up immediately, and then began to pick up the potatoes, in which both Little Dorrit and Arthur Clennam helped. Maggie picked up very few potatoes and a great quantity of mud, but they were all recovered and deposited in the basket. Maggie then smeared her muddy face with a shawl, and presenting it to Mr. Clennam as a type of purity, enabled him to see what she was like. She was about 28, with large bones, large features, large feet and hands, large eyes, and no hair. Her large eyes were limpid and almost colourless. They seemed to be very little affected by light, and to stand unnaturally still. There was also that attentive, listening expression in her face which is seen in the faces of the blind, but she was not blind, having one tolerably serviceable eye. Her face was not exceedingly ugly, though it was only redeemed from being so by a smile, a good-humoured smile, and pleasant in itself, but rendered pitiable by being constantly there. A great white cap, with a quantity of opaque frilling that was always flapping about, apologized for Maggie's baldness, and made it so very difficult for her old black bonnet to retain its place upon her head, that it held on round her neck like a gypsy's baby. A commission of haberdashers could alone have reported what the rest of her poor dress was made of, but it had a strong general resemblance to seaweed, with here and there a gigantic tea-leaf. Her shawl looked particularly like a tea-leaf after long infusion. Arthur Clennam looked at Little Dorrit with the expression of one saying, "May I ask who this is?" Little Dorrit, whose hand this Maggie, still calling her little mother, had begun to fondle, answered in words. They were under a gateway in which the majority of the potatoes had rolled. "This is Maggie, sir." "Maggie, sir," echoed the personage presented. "Little mother." "She is the granddaughter," said Little Dorrit. "Granddaughter," echoed Maggie, "of my old nurse, who has been dead a long time. Maggie, how old are you?" "10, mother," said Maggie. "You can't think how good she is, sir," said Little Dorrit, with infinite tenderness. "Good she is," echoed Maggie, transferring the pronoun in a most expressive way from herself to her little mother. "Or how clever," said Little Dorrit. "She goes on errands as well as anyone." Maggie laughed. "And is as trustworthy as the Bank of England." Maggie laughed. "She earns her own living entirely, sir," said Little Dorrit, in a lower and triumphant tone. "Really does." "What is her history?" asked Clennam. "Think of that, Maggie," said Little Dorrit, taking her two large hands and clapping them together. "A gentleman from thousands of miles away wanting to know your history." "My history!" cried Maggie. "Little mother!" "She means me," said Little Dorrit, rather confused. "She is very much attached to me. Her old grandmother was not so kind to her as she should have been. Was she, Maggie?" Maggie shook her head, made a drinking vessel of her clenched left hand, drank out of it and said, "Gin," then beat an imaginary child and said, "Broom handles and pokers." "When Maggie was 10 years old," said Little Dorrit, watching her face while she spoke, "she had a bad fever, sir, and she has never grown any older ever since." 10 years old," said Maggie, nodding her head. "But what a nice hospital! So comfortable, wasn't it? Oh, so nice it was. Such an heavenly place." "She had never been at peace before, sir," said Little Dorrit, turning towards Arthur for an instant and speaking low, "and she always runs off upon that." "Such beds there is there," cried Maggie. "Such lemonade, such oranges, such delicious broth and wine, such chicken. Oh, ain't it a delightful place to go and stop at?" "So Maggie stopped there as long as she could," said Little Dorrit, in her former tone of telling a child's story, the tone designed for Maggie's ear, "and at last, when she could stop there no longer, she came out. Then, because she never was to be more than 10 years old, however long she lived—" "However long she lived," echoed Maggie, "and because she was very weak, indeed was so weak that when she began to laugh she couldn't stop herself, which was a great pity." Maggie mighty grave of a sudden. "Her grandmother did not know what to do with her, and for some years was very unkind to her indeed. At length, in course of time, Maggie began to take pains to improve herself, and to be very attentive and very industrious, and by degrees was allowed to come in and out as often as she liked, and got enough to do to support herself, and does support herself. And that," said Little Dorrit, clapping the two great hands together again, "is Maggie's history, as Maggie knows." Ah! But Arthur would have known what was wanting to its completeness. Though he had never heard of the words little mother, though he had never seen the fondling of the small spare hand, though he had no sight for the tears now standing in the colourless eyes, though he had no hearing for the sob that checked the clumsy laugh. The dirty gateway, with the wind and rain whistling through it, and the basket of muddy potatoes waiting to be spilt again or taken up, never seemed the common hole it really was, when he looked back to it by these lights. Never, never. They were very near the end of their walk, and they now came out of the gateway to finish it. Nothing would serve Maggie but that they must stop at a grocer's window short of their destination for her to show her learning. She could read after a sort, and picked out the fat figures in the tickets of prices, for the most part correctly. She also stumbled, with a large balance of success against her failures, through various philanthropic recommendations to try our mixture, try our family black, try our orange-flavoured Pico, challenging competition at the head of flowery teas, and various cautions to the public against spurious establishments and adulterated articles. When he saw how pleasure brought a rosy tint into Little Dorrit's face when Maggie made a hit, he felt that he could have stood there making a library of the grocer's window until the rain and wind were tired. The courtyard received them at last, and there he said good-bye to Little Dorrit. Little as she had always looked, she looked less than ever when he saw her going into the Marshalsea Lodge passage, the little mother attended by her big child. The cage door opened, and when the small bird, reared in captivity, had tamely fluttered in, he saw it shut again, and then he came away.